Yeah, this is going to be kind of a journey through time in how we change the way that we grow fruit trees to really shrink them down to make them more efficient to manage and capture light. And it's really beneficial when you're thinking on how you can fit an orchard into a really confined space because these trees are taking up much less space and are a lot easier to pick. And so kind of start that journey. This is how trees have traditionally looked. This is how trees have evolved to grow. If you think of a tree in a forest, it's really in competition with all those other trees. And so fruit trees, just like all those other forest trees, have evolved to grow really large and first kind of get their footprint established. And so they grow vertically and then also spread horizontally. But when you took that tree out of a forest and put it into an orchard, it becomes really inefficient. You can see in this image there is these really large trees. They're about 30 feet tall. And the main thing in them that makes them really inefficient physiologically is that there's a ton of shade. So you can see really only on the interior of the tree is where you're getting a ton of shade, and you're only getting light on those exterior branches that are receiving light. And so then practically this is pretty difficult to work with. It takes a long time to manage these trees, to prune them, to pick them. You would often have to have people working on ladders 20 to 30 feet in the air. It's pretty dangerous. So there's been this shift in the way that we grow trees to shrink them down to make them what we more call a pedestrian orchard, which means you can do a lot of more work from the ground.
Hey, Jimmy, real quick.
Yeah.
Your slides are small. I'm not sure if there's
Yeah, it's like I may not be able to change it. I have like two screens. One of them's vertical. It's for some reason showing my presentation on the vertical screen. Is
okay.
it like unlegible?
I can see it okay, but I'm on a computer screen. I think it'll be
Okay,
fine for the recording, but I think we're probably okay if we can't fix it. So
okay. I'll try. Yeah, it's something like right when I go into presentation mode, it's like for some reason shifting that screen to my like vertical screen.
oh,
Uh,
thanks.
so yeah, this is kind of a review of a bunch of the different literature that's been done that kind of showed why the shift is important. And so on the x-axis here is light interception, and then on the y-axis is yield. And you can see there's this relationship that you get higher yields as you get more light intercepted by that canopy. And so really the main goal is to try to decrease shade in your canopy and get a uniform light environment throughout. And then visually, this is why this is important. And so this is a tree that has had all of its leaves removed at harvest. And then even in this pretty small tree, you can see that even with those different light environments, you still can have a pretty main effect on fruit quality. And so red coloration in apples is something that's pretty light and temperature dependent. And so in the lower portions of the canopy, where there would be a lot more shade, you can see those fruit didn't color very well. So those would be pretty low marketable. And so this is really why the shift to have a uniform light environment throughout the canopy is important. And so we've gone away from growing these complex 3D canopies to what we call a fruiting wall. And so that's a pretty planar up and down orchard where you are just growing trees in a pretty narrow width, but still growing them vertically. And so this has really been borrowed from grapes where vineyards are grown with these narrow, dense fruiting walls. So this kind of talk is going to go on how we've implemented these fruiting walls and then how you can do that in your home orchard. So this is kind of a blurry graph, but it's just showing that with similar to how light has been intercepted, if we increase our number of trees per acre, we can also get higher yields. So this is tree density on the x-axis and then yield on the y-axis, and then it just showed that positive relationship over two different cultivars with increasing tree density. However, when they applied economics to this, they found that with these higher tree density costs, you have a delayed return of value. And so this orange line is the highest tree density. And that is what's going to have the highest cost because you're paying currently it's probably $10 to $15 a tree. So when you're thinking of thousands of trees per acre, I think it's really expensive. And then you're adding in trellises and then the cost to train all these trees. And so they started to think of ways that you could use the same principles of increasing trees per acre, but make it a little less costly. And so they've thought of doing multiple leader systems. So spacing your trees out a little bit wider, but training them in a way that you can still have increased number of leaders, and then have those really good light environments to produce the highest quality of fruit. And so what they use is kind of this pretty old practice that was used in different gardens. And so this is an espalier tree that's growing in Paris in a garden. And it's probably 50 to 60 years old or older. And you can see it's got that bottom trunk and then it's got two axes that are spreading across from it. Then it's growing vertical branches off of those axes. And so that's one tree, but it's being grown in a very narrow canopy that's probably only 10 to 12 feet high. And then when you put that in a commercial setting, this is trees that are growing in New Zealand. And what they've done is to really shrink these trees, grow them in a vertical planar canopy. And then when you're thinking of small land area, what it allows you to do is really shove rows very close together. So these rows are spaced about 7 feet apart, which is about half the distance that we generally think of even our modern orchards today. And so it's just a way that you can try to increase your production in a per land basis. And then it also allows you to do different things like covering your orchards. So this is a sweet cherry block that is being grown under a retractable greenhouse. And so cherries can have a tendency to crack when they get rain on them. And what this system would do would be to close its roof when it senses rain to try to decrease that cracking and maintain the crop value for something that's really high value like a sweet cherry. And then if you can kind of see behind these rows, there's also heaters that are being placed into this orchard. And so if you can cover it up, you can raise the heat when you are about to experience a frost, and then protect your fruit that way. And also, you can kind of force bloom a little bit earlier and maybe be the first one to market if you can grow your trees in these really small canopies that are conducive to covering systems. So this is a retractable greenhouse, but it would also apply to different high tunnels and things like that. And so now I'm going to kind of get into how you establish these systems. So the most simple way is to just grow, instead of growing a vertical upright tree, you grow two axes. And so you can buy trees that are double budded. That's what this tree is. And so kind of on that main axis, it has two buds, and then you're just growing two vertical shoots off of it to fill your space. So that would be called a bi-axis tree. And then you kind of just maintain each of those leaders like they are their own tree. But what's a little more intensive is growing more than 2 liters. And there's a few different names. And so these were all kind of developed at similar timings by different groups around the world. And so they developed these different names. So one that was developed at Washington State by Matt Whiting and Greg Lang is called UFO, which is upright fruiting offshoots. And so they develop a canopy or a cordon-like structure, and they grow vertical shoots off of that. And then kind of the same system is also called a planar cordon, or in New Zealand, they call it FOPS, which is Feature Orchard Production Systems. But they're all kind of doing the same thing. And just kind of its terminology is, well, being referred to as, it first starts with a cordon, So that's borrowed from grapes. Grapes are grown on a cordon, and then you have your fruit shoots growing off of that. And so that's really how they developed these systems, is to grow their cordon. And so that's this bottom part, kind of what you would consider the main trunk of the tree. And then what you're growing off of that cordon is fruiting leaders. And so instead of having a tree at each of these different spacings, you're growing a leader off of your cordon to grow fruit on. So those are kind of two terms that I'll be referring to after this point. So to establish the system, you first have to consider how you're going to establish that cordon. And so the way that they had developed UFO was to plant a tree at a 45-degree angle. So instead of growing a tree vertically and then growing horizontal branches, you plant it at a 45-degree angle, then have branches growing off of that 45-degree cordon to then fill your vertical space. Another way to do it is to plant your tree vertically, either have those double buds, form your two axes, or just plant one vertically and then head it. And so on the left here is what a tree looks like. This is after its first year of growth in an orchard. But generally, when you get trees from a nursery, this is kind of how they look. They would be a little bit smaller. We would either have whips, which is just a vertical axis with little buds on them. Or you can get feathered trees. A feather is just a little horizontal branch that's growing off of that main trunk. And what you can do is to head the tree right above 2 or 3 growing points. So this right picture is 2 branches that are initiated. So if you were wanting to establish this cordon structure, this bi-axis in just a whip tree, you could let the trees leaf out and then cut it down towards the base right above where you have 2 or 3 buds that are growing into branches. And then in that year, let those 2 grow upright, and then you eventually in the dormancy then lay them down, kind of attach them to this bottom wire. And then in subsequent years, you're going to develop your leaders. So you have a slight advantage when you're planting that 45-degree angle, is that you can kind of begin growing your leaders in that first year, where if you're doing the bi-axis and laying them down, you want to establish your cordons in that first year and then lay them down. And then in 2 through 3, kind of grow your vertical branches. And so in this year, it's really, these first 3 years, it's pretty critical to not have any fruit on the tree. And you really want to focus just on filling that vertical space and getting to the top layer of the trees. And when you're kind of trying to fill this vertical space, one important consideration is how wide you should space those leaders. And it's really dependent on where you're producing fruit in the tree. And that's pretty dependent on species. So on the left here is a plum, and plum's fruit on little shorter spurs. And so you can see those axes and leaders are spaced a bit closer together than something like a peach, which is here on the right. Peaches grow on longer laterals. And so you need to space those leaders wider apart to be able to fill in and have those longer laterals to grow fruit on. So something like a sweet cherry, apple, plum, you can get away with having a little more leaders to the acre as compared to the nectarine or peach, where you need to have longer shoots to fruit on. So that's a main consideration. And then how you train those leaders is also important and can really be to your own preference. And so in environments, particularly where you have high light, such as Utah or in Washington or New Zealand, they'll tend to do what is here pictured on the right, which is to grow in a V. And so if you, instead of growing straight up and down horizontally, if you tilt those axes, you can intercept more light because you can capture light when the sun is lower in the sky, either right around sunrise or around sunset. That's generally why we have adopted the V structure that's a little harder to manage, because you then have kind of two canopies in the same row. And getting into that middle space, for pruning and thinning and things like that can be a little tricky. And so that's why you might lean towards more of an upright structure. But both of them are viable options, and it's just kind of preference. And so those are kind of things that you need to consider when you're establishing that vertical space. And then in subsequent years, you're just continually trying to fill your orchard space and then starting to crop. So you could probably carry a light crop in year 4. And then these systems are really been developed to be in the full production by year 5. And then so after that point, you're just maintaining vigor and fruiting wood. And so this is some of my master's work that I did at Michigan State. And this is a UFO tree that's about 10 years old. And you can see these darker woods that have been cut. Those were leaders that were initially developed. And what you get as these trees age is that those leaders age and become really large and kind of take over the tree. And so you want to maintain the kind of fruiting wood to have those upright leaders that are still fairly narrow in their caliber. You don't want any one vertical leader that's going to overtake the tree, because these trees still have that evolutionary mechanism to want to grow vertically. What this is doing is spreading the vigor out over that. So I had looked at this new method of pruning these trees, and that you would renew the tree to get those really large limbs out. And so the kind of traditional method is to be renewing annually after that 5-year period. So you take about 1 or 2 of these really large limbs out each period, each year, so that you have the cycle of young fruiting wood in the tree. But what this project did was to renew a whole tree at once. So you kind of switch your mindset from renewing 20% of your tree at once to 20% of an orchard at each year. And so either method really works. And so that's kind of how you maintain these trees. And that is really all I have. I just kind of wanted to give really a broad overview, and just kind of put this concept out there because it's a really new thing. Not even very many like commercial growers are growing trees in this way. But I thought it would have really applicability to small scale production, because you kind of just squeeze so many different trees into a small space this way. So thank you.
Awesome, thanks. Okay, we have a couple questions. So anyone that has more questions, if you want to put them into the Q&A, you're welcome to put some there. So one question from Kimball Clark was asking, are these apple trees that you've been showing in your presentation mostly dwarf apple trees?
Yeah, so yeah, apples are really the main species that we have dwarfing rootstocks for. And so that's why I didn't get too into rootstocks. With a multiple leader system, you would still want something that's a little bit vigorous, because you can still need that vegetative growth to fill your orchard space. But a lot of these pictures that I was showing with stone fruit, and stone fruit doesn't have as many options for dwarfing rootstocks. So that's actually really where you can use these different systems to spread your vigor out. So if you can have 5 leaders competing for space and resources, that's going to lower your vigor than if you just have one leader that's growing upright and really wants to grow strongly. So that's why I didn't get too into rootstocks. But yeah, apple is the one that you would really consider rootstock in these systems, because apple's the one that you have most rootstocks available.
Yeah, I know that there's a lot of options for apples for sure versus the other ones. Does it matter which direction that the rows face?
So we generally plant orchards north and south going down the row, because sun goes east to west, and so you have a sun that's going over your trees. If you're growing them north and south, that shade's going to go into the row, rather than if you're growing east to west, that shade would go down the row. If that makes sense. That would it out. So yeah, north-south is our general orientation.
Okay. Then I had another question. This one's from me. Have you done any yield data on versus like the old, like per acre, if you have a standard orchard like the one in the picture versus if you switch to do a more high density dwarfed trellis style of orchard?
Yes, this is pretty widely studied area, and most have generally shown that you get higher yields, with higher density, and especially you get earlier yields. So it takes a lot longer to establish a large canopy tree, than it does these really narrow canopies. And so you get faster fruiting production, generally as those trees age, kind of less labor costs. Um, and then trees in kind of the same space, I've seen that the UFO can yield higher than more just like standard upright tree.
Okay.
Can I ask a question real quick?
Yes, go ahead.
So as a panelist, it doesn't let me type the question in like I'm supposed to, so I'm just going to butt in. So you talked about the double budded tree, Jimmy. Is there for somebody that doesn't have access to a double budded nursery tree, what kind of success would there be in trying to develop multi-leaders on just a regular standard chip budded second year tree, like heading it or whatever? What kind of success, and does that vary by species and cultivar?
I've seen good success. I don't know that there's any published results, but the way that we had generally established orchards when I was in Michigan, with stone fruit was to just head trees. And so what you're really looking for is to head them right above where you have 3 or 4 new shoots that are leafing out. And then I've also tried it on apple in North Carolina, and it worked with those. And I headed them right above kind of 2 feathered limbs, and those grew out as well. So